The exhaustion was unlike anything I had ever experienced, a bone-deep, marrow-waking weariness that made my limbs feel like they were cast in lead. Yet, paradoxically, I had never felt so impossibly, undeniably alive. At 28 years old, I had just completed the most grueling marathon of my existence. 22 hours of unmedicated, back-breaking labor. 22 hours of gripping my husband Mark's hand so tightly I was certain I had fractured his knuckles. 22 hours of breathing through agonizing contractions that felt like tidal waves threatening to pull me under. But as I lay in the sterile, dimly lit hospital room, surrounded by the faint hum of medical equipment and the sharp scent of antiseptic, none of that pain mattered anymore. Resting against my chest, swaddled tightly in a faded cotton hospital blanket, was little Leo. He was perfect. A tiny, fragile miracle with a shock of dark hair and a button nose that twitched every time he let out a soft, mewling sigh. His miniature chest rose and fell in a steady, reassuring rhythm against my skin. I couldn't stop staring at him, tracing the delicate curve of his cheek with my index finger, marveling at the sheer impossibility of his existence. He was mine. He was ours. Mark sat in the vinyl armchair next to the hospital bed, his head tipped back against the wall, his chest rising and falling in deep, exhausted breaths. He looked like he had been through a war zone. His hair was disheveled, dark circles bruised the delicate skin under his eyes, and his usually crisp button-down shirt was wrinkled and stained with sweat and tears. He had been my absolute rock through the entire ordeal, whispering words of encouragement, holding ice chips to my chapped lips, and crying openly when Leo finally entered the world with a robust, healthy scream. Seeing him asleep now, bathed in the soft, blue glow of the monitors, my heart swelled with a love so profound it physically ached. We had been married for 4 years, together for 7, and our journey to this exact moment had been anything but easy. We had built a beautiful life together, deeply rooted in mutual respect, unwavering trust, and a shared sense of humor that carried us through the darkest of times. But there had always been a shadow looming over our happiness, a dark, suffocating cloud that refused to dissipate no matter how much sunshine we tried to let in. That cloud's name was Eleanor. Eleanor was Mark's mother, though monster-in-law would have been a far more accurate title. From the very first moment Mark introduced me to her at a stiflingly formal dinner party at their sprawling estate, she had made it abundantly clear that I was not, and would never be, good enough for her precious son. I was a graphic designer from a working-class family. She was a self-proclaimed socialite who obsessed over pedigree, country club memberships, and appearances. But her disdain for me went far beyond mere classism. It was a pathological, deeply ingrained hatred that manifested in the most insidious ways imaginable. Over the years, Eleanor had waged a relentless psychological war against me. When Mark proposed, she had loudly suggested in front of our entire family that I had trapped him. During our wedding planning, she had tried to cancel our caterer behind my back because she deemed the menu too ethnic. But her absolute favorite weapon, her go-to accusation whenever she felt her grip on Mark slipping, was her unshakable, delusional belief that I was unfaithful. It started with small, passive-aggressive remarks. If I worked late to finish a design project, she would call Mark and plant seeds of doubt, asking if he really knew who I was at the office with. If I went out for coffee with a male friend I had known since college, she would casually mention how comfortable I seemed with other men. But as our marriage progressed, her accusations grew bolder, more unhinged. She once hired a private investigator to follow me for a week while Mark was out of town on a business trip. When the Pies report yielded nothing more scandalous than me buying exorbitant amounts of iced coffee and visiting the local library, Eleanor had completely lost her mind, accusing the investigator of being incompetent and refusing to pay his full fee. Through it all, Mark had stood fiercely by my side. He had established strict boundaries, hung up on her midrant, and even instituted periods of no contact when her toxicity became too much to bear. But Eleanor was relentless. Like a weed you couldn't quite pull up by the roots, she always found a way to slither back into our lives, armed with a new arsenal of insults and suspicions. When we announced we were pregnant with Leo, I foolishly thought things might change. I thought the prospect of a grandchild might soften her hardened heart, might bridge the chasm she had dug between us. Instead, it threw a match into a powder keg. "Are you absolutely certain, Mark?" she had asked over the phone, her voice dripping with venom, fully aware that I was sitting right next to him on speakerphone. "You know how she is. You've been traveling so much for work lately. I'm just saying, it wouldn't hurt to be absolutely sure before you start celebrating a child that might not even share your blood." Mark had exploded, shouting at her with a ferocity I had rarely seen, before slamming the phone down. We hadn't spoken to her for the last 6 months of my pregnancy. It had been the most peaceful 6 months of my life. I should have known the silence wouldn't last. I should have known she was just biding her time, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The clock on the wall ticked past 3 in the morning. The hospital corridor outside our room was hushed, the silence punctuated only by the occasional squeak of a nurse's rubber-soled shoes on the linoleum floor. I closed my eyes, letting the heavy blanket of sleep finally begin to pull me down. Then, the door to our room violently swung open, hitting the wall with a deafening crack that echoed like a gunshot. I jolted upright, my heart hammering furiously against my ribs, instinctively clutching Leo tighter to my chest. The baby, startled by the sudden noise, let out a sharp, piercing wail. In the armchair, Mark startled awake, scrambling to his feet with wide, disoriented eyes, his fists unconsciously clenching. Standing in the doorway, framed by the harsh fluorescent lights of the hallway, was Alina. She looked absolutely manic. She was wearing a perfectly tailored beige trench coat over a designer silk blouse, her hair sprayed into a rigid, immovable helmet. But it was her eyes that terrified me. They were wide, wild, and blazing with a triumphant, unhinged fury. In her right hand, she clutched a sleek, brightly colored cardboard box. "Mom," Mark choked out, still half asleep and entirely bewildered. "What the hell are you doing here? How did you even get past security?" Alina ignored him completely. She marched into the room with the purposeful stride of an executioner, her high heels clicking sharply against the floor. She stopped at the foot of my bed, her gaze dropping to the squalling bundle in my arms. Her lip curled into a sneer of pure, unadulterated disgust. "Look at him," she spat, her voice trembling with rage. "Just look at him, Mark. I knew it. I told you, but you wouldn't listen to me. I told you she was a little tramp." My breath caught in my throat. My entire body began to tremble, a visceral reaction to the sudden, violent intrusion into what was supposed to be the most sacred, peaceful moment of my life. "Get out," Mark growled, his voice dropping to a dangerous, low octave. He stepped between Alina and the bed, using his body to shield me and the baby. "Get the hell out of this room right now, Alina, or I swear to God I will call security and have you dragged out." "Don't you dare take that tone with me, Mark," she shrieked, her voice echoing down the quiet maternity ward. "I am trying to save you. Look at the baby. Look at his hair. It's pitch black, you have light brown hair. He doesn't look a single thing like you." It was true that Leo had dark hair he had inherited from my side of the family, particularly my father. It was basic genetics, a concept that Alina was apparently perfectly willing to ignore if it suited her twisted narrative. By now, the commotion had attracted the attention of the hospital staff. 2 nurses rushed into the room, their faces pale with alarm, while a third hovered in the doorway, a walkie-talkie pressed to her mouth. "Ma'am, you need to leave right now." The head nurse, a stern-looking woman named Brenda, who had been my saving grace during labor, stepped forward. "This is a restricted area, and you are causing a massive disturbance. You cannot be in here." "Don't touch me," Alina shrieked, swatting at Brenda's arm as the nurse tried to gently guide her toward the door. "I'm not going anywhere until the truth comes out. I knew she was a filthy cheater, and I have the proof right here." She dramatically thrust the box she was holding into the air. I squinted at it, my exhausted brain struggling to process the bold, glossy lettering. "Premium Family Ancestry and Paternity DNA Kit. Overnight results. 99.9% accuracy. I bought this weeks ago," Alina ranted, her chest heaving as she glared at me over Mark's shoulder. "A private, incredibly expensive, state-of-the-art testing kit. It tests paternity, maternity, extended genetic lineage, everything. I demand a swab, right now. Swab that child's cheek, swab Mark's cheek, and let's prove once and for all that this little bastard doesn't belong to my son." The word hung in the air, heavy and vile. The nurses gasped. Mark let out a roar of absolute fury, lunging forward and grabbing his mother by the shoulders. "You are insane," he screamed, his face turning an angry, mottled red. "You are completely, utterly insane. I am so done with you. You are dead to me, get out." He practically shoved her toward the door, but Alina dug her heels in, fighting him like a cornered animal. "Do the test, you coward," she screamed at me, completely ignoring her son's physical efforts to remove her. "If you have nothing to hide, do the test. Prove it, prove you didn't sleep around. You won't because you know he's not Mark's. You're a liar and a whore." The room was descending into absolute chaos. The baby was screaming louder now, sensing the hostility and tension in the air. Mark was shouting for security. The nurses were trying to physically restrain a thrashing, shrieking Alina. My head was spinning, my body aching with every beat of my heart. I was so incredibly tired. Tired of the drama, tired of the accusations, tired of this miserable woman constantly trying to poison the beautiful life I had built. I looked at the DNA kit, which had fallen to the floor during the scuffle, its brightly colored packaging mocking me in the sterile hospital light. A sudden, bizarre wave of profound calm washed over me. It was the eye of the hurricane, a moment of crystal-clear clarity amidst the deafening noise. Fighting her would only prolong this nightmare. Throwing her out without taking the test would only give her ammunition. She would spend the rest of her miserable life telling everyone in Mark's family, all their friends, and anyone who would listen that I had refused the test because I was guilty. She would never stop. She would haunt my son's life forever. There was only one way to kill this beast. I had to let her spring her own trap. "Stop!" I yelled. My voice, though raspy and weak from hours of screaming during labor, managed to slice through the chaos. Everyone froze. Mark turned to look at me, his eyes wide with panic. Alina stopped thrashing against the nurses, a smug, triumphant smirk immediately plastering itself across her heavily made-up face. I carefully adjusted Leo in my arms, soothing his cries with a gentle shush, before looking dead into Alina's cold, hateful eyes. "I'll do it," I said, my voice eerily calm. "No," Mark shouted, rushing to my bedside. "Absolutely not. You don't have to prove anything to this psycho. I know he's my son. You are not humoring her delusions." I reached up and gently touched his cheek. "Mark, look at me," I whispered. "It's okay, let's just do it. Let's take the test. Because when those results come back and prove what we already know, she will never, ever be able to question my loyalty or my love for you again. We will have the ultimate, undeniable proof of her insanity. And then we are done with her. Forever." Mark looked deep into my eyes, searching for any sign of hesitation. Seeing none, his shoulders slumped in defeat. He nodded slowly, shooting a glare of pure hatred over his shoulder at his mother. Alina practically shoved the nurses aside, snatching the kit off the floor with trembling, eager hands. She ripped open the plastic packaging, pulling out the sterile swabs and vials. "The nurses are my witnesses," she declared loudly, pointing a manicured finger at the stunned medical staff. "You all saw her agree. Nobody touches these swabs but me." With exaggerated precision, she marched over to the bed. I didn't flinch as she leaned over me, her cloying perfume making my stomach churn. She aggressively rubbed the swab against the inside of tiny Leo's cheek, causing him to whimper in discomfort. She then sealed it in a vial and handed a second swab to Mark. He snatched it from her hand, violently swabbed his own mouth and shoved it back at her. "There," Mark spat, his voice laced with absolute disgust. "Are you happy now? You got what you wanted. Now get the hell out of my hospital room and don't you ever, ever speak to my wife again." Alina carefully packed the vials back into the box, treating it like it contained the Holy Grail. She looked at me, her smirk widening into a grotesque, triumphant grin. "Enjoy your little fantasy while it lasts, sweetheart," she whispered maliciously. "Because in a week, my son is going to realize exactly what kind of trash he married. And you'll be out on the street where you belong." With a dramatic swish of her trench coat, she turned and marched out of the room, her heels clicking away down the corridor, until the sound finally faded into the heavy, oppressive silence. The immediate aftermath was a blur of apologies. The nurses were incredibly sympathetic, offering to have security stationed permanently outside our door, assuring us that Alina had been permanently banned from the hospital premises. Mark sat on the edge of my bed, burying his face in his hands and sobbing, apologizing over and over again for his mother's atrocious behavior. I just held him, resting my chin on top of his head, feeling a strange sense of peace settling over me. The worst was over. I knew the truth. I knew my husband. I knew my baby. The DNA test was nothing more than a formality, a final nail in the coffin of Aliner's presence in our lives. The next week passed in a haze of sleep deprivation, dirty diapers, and overwhelming, profound love. Bringing Leo home was a dream. Seeing Mark evolve into a doting, fiercely protective father was everything I had ever hoped for. We existed in a beautiful, insular bubble, deliberately ignoring the outside world. We didn't speak of Aliner. We didn't speak of the test. We just focused on our little family. But the clock was ticking. Exactly 7 days after the nightmare at the hospital, the email arrived. We were sitting in our living room. I was nursing Leo on the couch, while Mark was mindlessly scrolling through his phone, looking for a podcast to play. Suddenly, his phone buzzed violently. I looked up and saw the blood drain completely from his face. "It's her," Mark whispered, his voice hoarse. "She forwarded the results." My stomach did a nervous little flip, not out of fear of the results, but out of anticipation for the confrontation that was about to occur. "Open it," I said steadily. "Wait," Mark said, holding up a hand. "She sent a text with it. She says she's coming over right now, and she brought my dad." Arthur, Mark's father, was a quiet, passive man who had spent the last 30 years bowing to Aliner's every whim just to keep the peace. He was a wealthy investment banker who spent most of his time at the office or on the golf course, deliberately avoiding his wife's manufactured dramas. If Aliner had dragged him along, it meant she believed she had the ultimate trump card. She wanted an audience for my execution. "Let them come," I said, adjusting my shirt and resting Leo against my shoulder to burp him. "Unlock the front door." 10 minutes later, the front door swung open. Aliner marched into our living room, looking like a cat that had just swallowed a canary. She was wearing a tailored Chanel suit, clutching a thick stack of printed papers in her manicured hands. Trailing slowly behind her, looking deeply uncomfortable and intensely apologetic, was Arthur. "Mark," Arthur mumbled, refusing to meet his son's eyes. "I'm so sorry." She wouldn't let it go. She insisted. "Save it, Dad," Mark snapped, standing up and crossing his arms over his chest. He glared at his mother. "You have 5 minutes, Aliner. Read the damn results and then get out of my house." Aliner laughed, a high, breathy sound that grated against my eardrums. "Oh, don't worry, Mark darling. I won't need 5 minutes. The truth is remarkably concise." She dramatically cleared her throat, licking her lips as she flipped to the second page of the thick report. She positioned herself right in the center of the living room, ensuring she had our undivided attention. "Let's see here," she began, her voice dripping with theatrical suspense. "Probability of paternity. Subject A, Mark. Subject B, baby Leo." She paused, looking up at me, waiting for me to break down in tears, waiting for the confession she so desperately craved. I simply stared back at her, my face a mask of absolute calm, gently patting Leo's back. Aliner frowned slightly at my lack of reaction, her eyes dropping back to the paper. Probability of paternity. Her voice trailed off. The silence in the room suddenly became deafening. Aliner stood frozen, staring at the paper in her hands. Her mouth opened, then closed, then opened again, like a fish gasping for air on dry land. The smug, triumphant sneer melted off her face, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated shock. The color rapidly drained from her cheeks, leaving her looking sickly and pale beneath her heavy makeup. "Well," Mark demanded, taking a step forward. "Read it. What does it say, Mom?" "What does it say?" Aliner's hands began to tremble so violently that the papers rattled loudly against each other. She couldn't speak. She just kept staring at the bold black ink, her eyes darting back and forth in frantic disbelief. Impatient and enraged, Mark crossed the room in 3 large strides, snatching the papers out of her shaking hands. He flipped to the page she had been staring at. "Probability of paternity," Mark read aloud, his voice booming with authority. 99.99%. Subject A cannot be excluded as the biological father of Subject B. Mark let out a massive, shuddering breath, a tear of relief escaping his eye as he looked over at me. A massive smile broke across his face. he turned back to his mother, his expression hardening into stone. "He's mine," Mark growled. "He is my son, just like I knew, just like my wife told you. You vicious, paranoid, pathetic woman. You put us through hell for absolutely nothing." Arthur let out a heavy sigh, running a hand over his thinning gray hair. "Eleanor, I told you," he murmured tiredly. "I told you this was a mistake. You owe them a massive apology." But Eleanor didn't seem to hear him. She was still frozen, her eyes wide with terror, her chest heaving as she struggled to pull air into her lungs. She looked like she had just seen a ghost. "No," Eleanor whispered, her voice barely audible. "No, no, no, that's not possible, keep reading." "I don't need to keep reading," Mark yelled, waving the papers in her face. "The test proves he's mine, that's it. We're done here." "Keep reading," Eleanor suddenly shrieked, a sound so shrill and desperate it made Leo jump in my arms. "The second page, the extended genetic panel. Look at it." Mark frowned, confused by her sudden, frantic desperation. He flipped to the next page of the thick packet. The premium kit Eleanor had purchased didn't just test immediate paternity. It ran a comprehensive analysis against its massive database to map out family trees, ancestral lineages, and immediate biological relations of anyone who submitted a swab. Because Eleanor had set up the account, her DNA data from a previous ancestry test years ago was automatically cross-referenced, along with Arthur's data from a health screening kit he had done the year prior. I watched as Mark's eyes scanned the dense blocks of text and colorful pie charts. Slowly, the triumphant anger on his face morphed into a mask of total, utter confusion. His brow furrowed deeply, his eyes darting across the page as if trying to decipher a foreign language. I don't understand," Mark muttered, his voice dropping to a confused whisper. "What is it?" I asked, a sliver of genuine anxiety finally piercing my calm facade. Mark looked up at Arthur, then over to Eleanor, who was now trembling so hard she looked like she might collapse. "It maps out the genetic links," Mark said slowly, pointing a shaking finger at the page. "It shows Leo's DNA, my DNA, and how it matches with the system's existing profiles. It says here. It says I share exactly 0% of my DNA with Dad." Arthur froze. The tired, passive look on his face vanished, instantly replaced by a sharp, piercing alertness. "What?" Arthur asked, his voice deceptively quiet. 0%, Mark repeated, his eyes wide, looking at the man who had raised him for almost 30 years. "It says there is absolutely no biological relationship between me and Arthur. None." The air in the room felt heavy, suffocating. I felt the breath leave my lungs. Had there been a mix-up at the hospital when Mark was born? Was he adopted and they never told him? "Eleanor," Arthur said, turning slowly to look at his wife. His voice was cold, harder than I had ever heard it. "What does that mean? Why does my son not share my DNA?" Eleanor was sobbing now, heavy ugly tears ruining her expensive mascara. She backed away from her husband, holding her hands up in a defensive gesture. "Arthur, please. It was 30 years ago. It was a mistake, a stupid, terrible mistake." "You cheated on me," Arthur stated, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. He staggered back a step. "You had an affair. All these years you accused everyone else of being unfaithful, you projected your own filth onto Mark's wife. Because you were the one who cheated. Mark isn't my son. He's the only father I've ever known," Mark whispered, looking utterly devastated as he stared at the paper. But then, Mark's eyes dropped further down the page. He froze again. His jaw dropped. "Wait," Mark choked out, his voice cracking violently. "Wait, what the hell is this?" "What else?" Arthur demanded, stepping closer to look at the paper. Mark looked up at Eleanor, his eyes burning with a mixture of betrayal, horror, and profound confusion. It says I share 0% DNA with you, too." The silence returned, heavier and darker than before. I felt the room begin to spin. 0% with Arthur, and 0% with Eleanor. "How is that possible?" I blurted out, unable to stop myself. "How can you share no DNA with your mother? Did the hospital switch you at birth? Eleanor, what happened?" Eleanor collapsed to her knees, burying her face in her hands, her wails echoing off the walls of our living room. It was the sound of a woman whose entire world, built entirely on a foundation of lies and deceit, was violently collapsing around her. Arthur grabbed the papers from Mark's hands, furiously scanning the text himself. He stared at the results, then looked down at his sobbing wife on the floor. "Explain this to me right now," Arthur roared, a terrifying sound that shook the very foundations of the house. "How does the son you supposedly gave birth to share absolutely no DNA with you? Explain it." It took 10 minutes of hysterical sobbing, unintelligible babbling, and aggressive demanding from Arthur before the horrifying, putrid truth finally dragged itself out of the darkness and into the light. 30 years ago, Elinor had indeed been having a torrid, long-term affair. The man was a wealthy, powerful real estate developer, older and married himself. Elinor had been convinced that if she got pregnant, the man would leave his wife and marry her, elevating her status to the upper echelons of high society she so desperately craved. But there was a problem. Elinor had quietly visited a fertility specialist and discovered a devastating secret. She was completely barren, incapable of having children. Desperate, she lied to the man, claiming she was pregnant. Simultaneously, she began faking a pregnancy with Arthur, wearing padding, forging ultrasound documents, and refusing to let Arthur attend any doctor appointments, claiming she was going to an exclusive, high-end private clinic that didn't allow spouses in the room. The wealthy affair partner, however, had his own secrets. He had accidentally gotten one of his much younger, incredibly desperate mistresses pregnant. The young woman didn't want the child and was threatening to go to the press and ruin his career and his marriage. A horrifying, mutually beneficial arrangement was made in the shadows. Elinor agreed to take the young mistress's baby the moment he was born. She traveled to a private clinic in Switzerland for a supposedly complicated, high-risk delivery. In reality, she waited in a hotel until the young mistress gave birth, took the newborn baby boy, paid off the clinic staff to falsify the birth certificate, and flew home to present the child to Arthur as his own. Her plan had been to use the child as leverage against the wealthy affair partner. But shortly after Mark was born, the man suffered a massive, fatal heart attack. His empire crumbled, his secrets were buried, and Elinor was left holding a baby that wasn't hers, trapped in a marriage she had tried to escape. She had raised Mark, a child entirely unrelated to her or her husband, a constant, living reminder of her greatest failure. And because she knew exactly how easy it was to lie, how easy it was to deceive a spouse and pass off a child as someone else's, she became utterly, violently paranoid that everyone else was doing the exact same thing. Her relentless accusations against me weren't just cruelty, they were a massive, psychological projection of her own horrifying guilt. As the story unraveled, filling the room with its toxic, suffocating stench, Mark slowly sank onto the couch beside me. He looked broken. A man who had just discovered his entire existence, his entire identity, was built on a monstrous lie. I pulled him close, wrapping my free arm tightly around him as he wept quietly into my shoulder. Arthur stood over his wife, his face pale and completely devoid of emotion. He looked at the woman he had been married to for 35 years, the woman he had tolerated, supported, and funded, and he looked at her with nothing but absolute, freezing disgust. "I am going to call my lawyers," Arthur said, his voice terrifyingly calm. "I am going to freeze every single joint bank account. I am going to cancel your credit cards. I am going to sell the house. And I am going to divorce you." Elinor lunged forward, grabbing Arthur by the ankles, sobbing hysterically. "No, Arthur, please, I did it for us. I wanted to give you a family. Please, you can't leave me." Arthur forcefully kicked his leg out, shaking her grip off him like she was a diseased rat. "Don't you ever touch me again," Arthur sneered. He turned to look at Mark, his eyes softening slightly, a profound sadness breaking through the anger. "Mark, I don't care what that piece of paper says. I changed your diapers. I taught you how to ride a bike. I paid for your college. You are my son, you always will be, but I cannot be near this monster for another second." "I know, Dad," Mark whispered, his voice trembling. "I know." Arthur nodded curtly, turned on his heel, and walked out the front door without looking back. Elinor was left weeping on the floor of our living room, a pathetic, crumpled pile of expensive clothing and shattered delusions. She looked up at Mark, reaching a trembling hand toward him. "Mark," she whimpered. "My baby boy." Mark stood up, his tears had stopped. His face hardened into a mask of pure ice. He walked over to the front door and pulled it wide open. "You are not my mother," Mark said, his voice echoing with a dark, terrifying finality. "You are a kidnapper. You are a liar. And you are a monster. Get out of my house. If you ever contact me, my wife, or my son again, I will go to the police and I will tell them exactly what you did 30 years ago." Eleanor stared at him, realizing in that exact moment that it was entirely, irrevocably over. She had pushed too far. In her manic desperation to destroy my life, she had completely annihilated her own. Slowly, painfully, she pulled herself up off the floor. She didn't look at me. She just walked out the door, her shoulders slumped, her expensive heels dragging heavily against the floorboards. Mark slammed the door shut behind her and locked the deadbolt. He leaned his forehead against the heavy wood, taking a deep, ragged breath. I walked over to him, holding Leo securely against my chest, and wrapped my free arm around his waist. He turned and pulled us both into a fierce, desperate hug. It took months for the dust to fully settle. True to his word, Arthur filed for divorce immediately. Because Eleanor had admitted to fraud, deceit, and arguably kidnapping in front of witnesses, the divorce proceedings were brutally swift and entirely one-sided. The prenuptial agreement they had signed decades ago contained a strict infidelity clause that Arthur's lawyers aggressively enforced. Eleanor was left with absolutely nothing. No house, no alimony, no country club memberships. The last we heard through the family grapevine, she was living in a cramped one-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of the city, working as a receptionist at a low-end dental clinic just to pay her rent. Mark underwent intense therapy to deal with the trauma of his newly discovered origins. We debated trying to find his biological parents, but ultimately, Mark decided against it. The biological father was dead, and the mother had willingly given him away. He realized that biology didn't make a family. Love, loyalty, and shared experiences did. Arthur remained incredibly active in our lives, dotting on Leo with the fierce, unconditional love of a true grandfather. As I sat in the nursery one evening, gently rocking Leo to sleep as the golden light of the setting sun filtered through the curtains, I couldn't help but smile. Eleanor had tried to destroy my family. She had tried to humiliate me, to cast me out into the cold. Instead, she had handed us the key to our own liberation. By trying to prove I was a cheater, she had exposed herself as the ultimate fraud. The monster had finally been slain, not by my hand, but by her own arrogant, paranoid stupidity. And as little Leo drifted off to sleep, safely tucked into his crib, wrapped in the warmth of a home, finally free from toxic shadows, I knew that we were going to live happily ever after.